Well, Matt Walsh, the political commentator, has recently responded to some comments that Pope Leo made when he was asked about an award that was given by an archbishop to Senator Dick Durbin. And the questions surrounding this issue relate to the topic of abortion. Dick Durbin is one who supports abortion. The Catholic Church is against abortion. How can it be that an archbishop is giving an award to such a person that would be essentially condoning murder and even promoting it? And the Pope responded with some very troubling comments, and Matt Walsh is right to critique them. And yet these critiques of the Pope raise some important questions about the issue of papal authority and papal infallibility. Matt Walsh seems to be under the impression that the Pope can be critiqued from the Bible. If you're unfamiliar with what Matt Walsh said, here's a clip of what he said.
I just wanted to ask one thing that has become a bit of a divisive subject in the U.S. right now, with Cardinal Cupich giving an award to Senator Durbin. Some people of faith are having a hard time with understanding this because he is he's for legalized abortion. How would you help people of faith right now decipher that, feel about that, and how do you feel about that?
I'm not terribly familiar with the particular case. I think that it's very important to look at the overall work that a senator has done during, if I'm not mistaken, 40 years of service in the United States Senate. I understand the difficulty and the tensions, but I think, as I myself have spoken in the past, it's important to look at many issues that are related to what is the teaching of the Church. Someone who says I'm against abortion but says I'm in favor of the death penalty is not really pro-life. So someone who says that I'm against abortion but I'm in agreement with the inhuman treatment of immigrants in the United States, I don't know if that's pro-life. So they're very complex issues. I don't know if anyone has all the truth on them, but I would ask first and foremost that there be greater respect for one another and that we search together both as human beings, in that case as American citizens or citizens of the state of Illinois, as well as Catholics, to say we need to really look closely at all of these ethical issues and to find the way forward as Church. Church teaching on each one of those issues is very clear.
Well, that is a really bad answer. That's a bad answer. And it's not bad in some kind of semantic way. Okay, as a Catholic, I wouldn't sit here and be pedantic and pick the Pope apart just to prove that I'm smart or something. Okay, I don't want to, the Pope. Well, actually, Pope Leo. But actually, let me tell you, just kind of smug, correcting someone. I don't want to do that. I wouldn't do that. But what he said, his answer is just fundamentally bad. It's fundamentally bad and wrong. And it's potentially deeply confusing for a lot of people. So it needs to be addressed. It just has to be. I know there are some Catholics, some, very conservative Catholics. I'm one of them. So these are people I relate to in so many ways. But for some very conservative Catholics, they take the view that as a Catholic like myself in the public eye, I just should not be publicly criticizing the Pope at all. It's not appropriate to do. That's the view of some very conservative Catholics. And I disagree with that. I mean, I don't like doing it. It's sad to have to do it. But when you have the Pope saying stuff like this, well, we're just gonna let it sit out there. We're gonna let it, just let it go unopposed. We can't. You can't do that. It's scandalous. People are scandalized by this. Led astray. Now, it would be one thing if we could rely on church leadership a little bit farther down the ladder to speak up in these scenarios and offer clarification. But we can't. And so it relies on just normal people to speak up and say this is wrong. And this is just wrong. It really is. It's outrageously wrong. He says that if you're against abortion but in favor of the death penalty, then you aren't really pro-life. Okay. That is, again, wrong and ridiculous. I mean, first of all, God himself prescribes the death penalty in the Bible. Is God not pro-life? I mean, this is why you cannot, as a Christian, take the position that the death penalty is fundamentally or inherently immoral or inherently, anti-life, which is the same thing as being fundamentally immoral. You can't take that position. That position is ruled out. It's off the table. God ordains it. He prescribes it. So if you believe the death penalty is fundamentally wrong or anti-life, you're either saying that God is guilty of a moral crime, or you're saying that the Bible does not accurately record God's commands. And both of those claims are themselves inadmissible for a Catholic.
Now, Matt Walsh is clearly right to point out that there are significant problems with what Pope Leo has said. And in fact, when we look at what Pope Leo said about abortion, really he is just giving the cliche talking points from anyone who would be on the left. I mean, these are just left-wing talking points. You cannot be pro-life if you are for the death penalty. That's a contradiction in terms. Really, it's a way of thinking that is just completely ignorant of moral categories, basic moral categories. It is actually in the scriptures, as Matt Walsh actually rightly points out, a preservation of life. It is in fact pro-life to be for the death penalty, and this is because you are declaring the worth of the person that was killed by executing the person that killed him. And Matt Walsh is correct as well to teach that this is from the Bible. Genesis 9, verse 6 is where we see this, where it's not just stated that there will be men who will be put to death for killing other people, but even it is decreed that it will be at the hands of other men. So this is clearly referring to the death penalty. Genesis chapter 9, verse 6, which says this: "Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image." So the idea is the worth of the person slain can be seen in the fact that he is made in the image of God, and therefore the one who slays the one who is made in the image of God must himself be put to death, whether it be man or beast. That's the implication of Genesis chapter 9. We see further that there are many examples of the death penalty being executed in the Old Testament, and this was not something that was abrogated in the New Testament either. You think of Paul's teachings about the civil government in Romans chapter 13, where he says that the civil government has been given the sword. The civil government bears the sword for the purpose of punishing the wicked and rewarding the righteous. Now, the sword has not been given to the church. This is not talking about the church executing this, but it is, in fact, the function of the civil government to do this. The fact that this power is described as bearing the sword clearly means that the state is able to execute the death penalty. The idea of the use of the sword is that you can execute people using it if they have done something that is worthy of death. Now, all of this is clear, but the main thing I really want to consider is Matt Walsh's critique of the Pope in relationship to the claims of papal infallibility. You'll note that what is happening here is that Matt Walsh is critiquing the Pope by appealing to the Bible. The implication of Matt Walsh's arguments are that the Bible is clear about this issue, that the Pope's statements can be understood in light of the Bible, and if the Pope's statements are contrary to the express teaching of the Bible, then it is the Pope who is wrong. That is essentially the argument that Matt Walsh is making. And in fact, he even says that if a Pope were to say something contrary to the Bible, the Pope would be wrong because he would be trying to critique God himself. That is the implication that's being given. And my point here in making this video is that is the Protestant principle, that any church authority could get something wrong. The ultimate authority whereby we can judge whether or not a church leader has gotten something wrong is in fact the Bible, which does in fact speak clearly. Now, you may say, well, this doesn't count because the Pope wasn't speaking ex cathedra or something like this. And you could say, well, this doesn't actually invalidate the doctrine of papal infallibility. However, even this response invites more questions and raises even more problems. For instance, could now be asked, where in the Bible does it say that the Pope can err except when he's speaking ex cathedra? The concept of the Pope is not even in the Bible. So the idea here is that we're now involving ourselves in circular reasoning to the extreme. The concept of the Pope is not in the Bible. The idea of him speaking ex cathedra is not in the Bible. And yet here you have Matt Walsh critiquing him according to the Bible. The whole thing is a very convoluted mess. But even aside from this response actually does involve a person in historical claims. You say, well, this doesn't count because the Pope was not speaking ex cathedra. And implicit in this argument would be that the Pope has never given his opinion on something ex cathedra, like Pope Leo just did with regard to abortion and the moral equivalences with treatment of immigrants and the death penalty, that sort of thing. That a Pope has never given his opinion on that sort of thing, being influenced from the world in a statement that is ex cathedra. Now, just to think about this another way, what if the Pope at some point does make a declaration ex cathedra with regard to abortion, and draws a moral equivalence with the death penalty, and declares that the death penalty is something that is wrong and sinful? He would be contradicting the Bible. How would that work with papal infallibility? Now, perhaps you could say, well, God would never allow that to happen. So you've got the Pope, who has the authority to make ex cathedra statements. He clearly has revealed on this issue that he is not biblical, and that he is speaking in accordance with the ways of the world. But then you're saying perhaps a third point would be that God would never allow this man in this situation to ever make a statement ex cathedra that would be related to this. Now, we could say that perhaps that's a hypothetical view of the future. But what about the past? Are there any examples of the Pope speaking ex cathedra on an issue and getting something wrong? And the answer to that is clearly there are many examples of this. Just consider just a few things that have been stated in the history of the Catholic Church and the history of the papacy. You think of the early 14th century when Boniface VIII makes his declaration Unam Sanctam, where he says, "We declare, say, define, and pronounce." Quite strong language about whatever is going to come next. We declare, say, define, and pronounce that it is absolutely necessary for salvation that every human creature be subject to the Roman pontiff. So there you have a declaration about salvation, the most significant issue that the church could speak to, how a person can be saved from their sins. And he says there is an absolute necessity of being subject to the Roman pontiff, of being a Roman Catholic in this sense. But then you think of what is said in Vatican II, Lumen Gentium, in section 16, those who, through no fault of their own, do not know the gospel of Christ or his church, but who nevertheless seek God with a sincere heart, may achieve eternal salvation. Now, both of these statements are obviously contrary to the scriptures. Neither one of them represents the teaching of the scriptures. And even more than that, the two statements, one from the 14th century and the other from the 20th century, are fundamentally contradictory to one another. They cannot be harmonized. And this is not on some small issue. This is actually even a bigger issue than the issue that Matt Walsh is pointing to. This is talking about the salvation of souls. And Boniface VIII got it wrong in the 14th century. And then Vatican II makes an exactly contradictory claim in the middle of the 20th century, which is also equally unbiblical. So here you've got an example that there's no way to harmonize with the Bible. There's no way to harmonize the two statements together. You think of even another example. Even the concept of papal infallibility is an invention of the late Middle Ages. In the 14th century, there were Franciscan monks who were concerned that the decrees of a previous pope that were in their favor would be undone by a later pope. And so they pitched to John the 22nd, Pope John the 22nd, this idea of papal infallibility in order to try to bind John the 22nd to the decrees of a former pope. John the 22nd, Pope John the 22nd, actually then argued against the doctrine of papal infallibility on the grounds of him not wanting to be subject to the decisions of former popes. So then the question is, which is it? Is a pope actually infallible? If the pope is infallible now, what do we do with the statements of Pope John the 22nd, who did not seem to think that the popes were infallible at all? You can consider even further. In the 7th century, Pope Honorius, speaking about the controversy of the one versus two wills of Christ, this would be getting at the doctrine of the incarnation. He actually taught and spoke ex cathedra, teaching the one will of Christ heresy. And this was actually laid out, particularly in the Sixth Ecumenical Council, that Christ, in fact, does, according to the scriptures, have two wills, which is clearly the teaching of the Bible. So there you have a pope speaking ex cathedra about something in the 7th century, which is then later in the same century condemned as heresy by an ecumenical council. So is it the case that the pope is infallible or not? And is it possible for a pope to be critiqued according to the scriptures? There are many examples of this in the history of the papacy. And here's the significant issue. If it is possible that the pope could get something wrong, if there are examples of this in the history of the church, and if the way we would know that the pope got something wrong would be to look at the scriptures and to consider what the plain teaching of the scriptures are on a given topic, then the implication is that this could also have been the case in the 16th century. And what I would say is clearly was the case on the issue of justification by faith. You think of what the Apostle Paul just very clearly teaches. We know that a person is not justified by works of the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ. And so we have believed in Jesus Christ, that we might be justified by faith in Christ and not by works of the law, because through the works of the law, no flesh will be justified. Said 3 different ways by the Apostle Paul in Galatians chapter 2, verse 16, very clearly. If there is a church that teaches something contrary to the plain meaning of the scriptures, would we not have the right, as Matt Walsh just did, as a Catholic, to say this is not the teaching of God? That if you contradict this teaching of God, you are contradicting God himself. You're either doing that or you're charging the scriptures with error. This would be to apply the same thing that Matt Walsh just did with the Pope to the doctrine of justification. Now, another issue with regard to papal infallibility, and this really highlights a great weakness of the Catholic Church. We often hear that the Roman Catholic Church is the most stable of all churches, that it will never change because there is this institutional continuity with the early church, and it goes all the way back to the apostles, and this just shows how the church is unchanging. But just consider actually how easy it is for the Roman Catholic Church to change on its core doctrines. All you need is one man at the top of the church, the Pope, being convinced of something that is unbiblical, to be influenced by the world, and for his statements to be treated as infallible when they are not. That is the only thing that is needed. If one man becomes convinced of something that is an error, and he speaks in a way where everyone takes his words to be infallible when they are not, you will get a church that is changing all the time. And if you look at the history of the church, this is actually what you do see. There are many innovations that have crept into the Roman Catholic Church because of decrees of different popes. Now, consider on the other hand, the Reformed faith, and consider the stability that we have. We would say any doctrine must be proved from the Bible, and the Bible does not change. The Bible cannot change, and therefore the doctrines of the Bible and of the church cannot change. And so if someone were to say, Pope Leo or some other church leader in the Reformed faith were to speak in a way that is contrary to the teachings of the Scriptures, we would say that is not the teaching of the Scripture. And the doctrine of the church would remain unchanged. If it is the case that the foundation for the church's teaching is the Scriptures, then it will also be the case that in every age there will be many people who will test all the statements of men against the Scriptures, and so preserve the faith of the apostles as it has been handed down to us. If you're looking for stability against the modern world, you can clearly see from this Pope, he has been influenced by it. He's been influenced by it, which means, as the head of the Roman Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church is influenced by the doctrines and teachings of the world. There is great change in this regard. And you'd say, well, where can I go then for stability against this? Now, the devil tries to get his way into everywhere. But the best place you can go is to that church which stands upon the word of God alone and says, if you are going to give us a new doctrine, you must show us where that doctrine is found in the Bible. And if you cannot do that, then we will reject it. That is the most stable place you can go to, and that is the position of the Reformed faith.